Hello everyone, and welcome to the Young and the Restless channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The storm surrounding the Young and the Restless was already building long before Phyllis Summers realized exactly who the mysterious stranger sitting across from her truly was. What began as an innocent encounter at the glowing bar inside the GCAC slowly transformed into something darker, more dangerous, and far more personal than she could have imagined. During the May 7th episode, Phyllis found herself unexpectedly drawn to a man calling himself Matt Clark, a quiet stranger with haunted eyes and fragments of confusion clouding every word he spoke. There was something strangely vulnerable about him, something broken beneath the surface that immediately stirred Phyllis's curiosity. Their conversation flowed naturally, layered with cautious flirtation and emotional tension until the truth began to emerge piece by piece. The man confessed he was suffering from amnesia, trapped in a terrifying fog where memories refused to return, and Phyllis, having never met the real Matt Clark before, had no reason to suspect the nightmare standing right in front of her. To her, he was simply a lost soul searching desperately for answers, a damaged man wandering through Genoa City with no understanding of who he really was or the destruction attached to his name. Days later, the tension escalated in ways neither of them could have predicted. On the May 13th episode, fate pushed their paths together once again when Phyllis spotted Matt speaking with Patty Williams at Crimson Lights, a moment that instantly sent warning bells ringing through her instincts. Patty's presence alone carried enough emotional chaos to make anyone uneasy, and before things could spiral further, Phyllis quickly intervened and pulled her confused companion away from the encounter. The two eventually settled at a nearby table, the warm atmosphere of the coffee house standing in sharp contrast to the growing darkness hovering around them. Once again, flirtation danced between them, subtle but undeniable. Yet beneath those moments lingered something heavier, a desperate plea from a man terrified of his own missing past. Matt asked Phyllis for help, hoping she could somehow guide him toward the truth of who he really was. There was sincerity in his voice, genuine fear hiding beneath his confusion, and for a brief moment, it almost became easy to forget that this man carried a name capable of sending shockwaves through the Newman family. But then came the conversation that changed everything. Matt began recounting a deeply unsettling encounter with someone named Noah, a man who apparently despised him with an intensity that Matt himself could not understand. The confusion in his eyes only deepened as he tried piecing together scattered fragments of memory, desperately searching for meaning inside reactions that made no sense to him. Then another name slipped into the conversation: Victor. The moment that name crossed his lips, something shifted inside Phyllis instantly. The atmosphere around her seemed to freeze as realization crashed into her mind all at once. Viewers could practically see the wheels turning behind her eyes as every scattered clue suddenly connected with terrifying clarity. Noah's hatred, Victor's involvement, the mystery man with no memory. In that instant, Phyllis finally understood that the stranger she had been comforting and flirting with was none other than the infamous Matt Clark, the ruthless enemy whose obsession with destroying Nick Newman, Sharon Newman, and the entire Newman family had stretched across years of pain, manipulation, and emotional devastation. The truth hit like a lightning strike, leaving Phyllis sitting face to face with a man whose past was drenched in chaos. Even if he himself no longer remembered any of it. Suddenly, every choice standing before Phyllis became impossibly complicated. She understood better than most exactly how dangerous Matt Clark could be when left unchecked. She knew the emotional torment he had inflicted on Nick over the years, the fear and destruction he had brought into the lives of people she still deeply cared about despite all the complicated history between them. Even now, after everything, Nick remained the father of Summer Newman, and that connection alone guaranteed that Phyllis would never completely turn her back on him when real danger emerged. Yet compassion and self-preservation were now colliding inside her in the worst possible way. Because while Matt sat beside her as a vulnerable and confused man stripped of his memories, Phyllis herself was fighting a devastating crisis of her own. Victor Newman had already launched a brutal attack against her future, manufacturing AI-generated evidence that falsely painted her and Kane Ashby as criminals who illegally seized Newman Enterprises. The fabricated evidence looked horrifyingly real, convincing enough that Victoria Newman delivered the damaging emails directly to Christine Ramalotti, triggering arrests that sent shockwaves through Genoa City. Now, Phyllis and Kane faced the terrifying possibility of years behind bars for crimes they did not actually commit, trapped in a nightmare built entirely on deception. That reality changed the stakes of everything. As upcoming spoilers for May 14th hinted that Phyllis would begin setting a trap, the emotional tension surrounding her next move intensified dramatically. She was no longer simply protecting a confused man with amnesia. She was standing at the center of a dangerous chess match involving Victor Newman, Nick Newman, and one of the most hated enemies their family had ever faced. Phyllis knew Matt represented leverage, possibly the only powerful bargaining chip she had left in a situation rapidly spiraling out of her control. If she handed Matt over to the Newman family, she could position herself as the unlikely hero who delivered a dangerous villain straight into their hands. And in return, perhaps she could demand something equally valuable: freedom. The possibility of negotiating dropped charges suddenly became very real. Phyllis understood how treacherous Victor could be, but she also understood that even Victor Newman might recognize the value of recovering a dangerous enemy before more damage could be done. Meanwhile, spoilers for May 15th suggested that Nick himself would soon make a dangerous deal, adding even more suspense to the growing storm ready to explode across Genoa City. Yet beneath all the schemes, calculations, and survival instincts, there remained a deeply human conflict tearing Phyllis apart emotionally. Because despite her flaws, despite every manipulative decision she had made over the years, Phyllis Summers was not heartless. She was many things: impulsive, cunning, unpredictable, but she was not a monster. Looking at Matt now, stripped of the cruel certainty that once defined him, she could see someone broken and vulnerable rather than the ruthless mastermind from the past. But at the same time, she also knew what he was capable of if those memories ever returned. Every second she delayed could place Nick, Sharon, Noah, and even Summer in danger all over again. The emotional weight of that reality pressed heavily on her shoulders, forcing her to choose between sympathy and responsibility. Whether she decided to expose Matt in exchange for immunity, hand him over simply hoping Nick would reward her kindness, or devise some entirely different plan altogether, one truth had already become unavoidable: Matt Clark's fragile peace inside Genoa City was coming to an end. As the walls slowly began closing in around him, the tragedy of Matt's situation became almost impossible to ignore. Here was a man wandering through a city filled with people who hated him, feared him, and carried scars from the damage he once caused, yet he could not even remember why. The ghosts of his past were already circling closer with every passing moment, preparing to unleash consequences he never saw coming. And while Phyllis wrestled internally with what kind of woman she truly wanted to be, the danger surrounding both of them continued to grow stronger. The Newmans would not rest once they learned Matt Clark was back in Genoa City. Old wounds would reopen, buried fury would rise again, long-standing vendettas would explode back to life. And no matter how confused or vulnerable Matt appeared now, the wrath waiting for him promised to be brutal. One way or another, the past was coming for him. And when it finally arrived, nothing in Genoa City would remain calm for long. The deeper Phyllis Summers fell into this dangerous secret, the more impossible it became to separate truth from emotion. Every glance across the table at Matt Clark now carried a completely different meaning than it had only days earlier. What once felt like harmless chemistry between two lonely people had transformed into a tense psychological battlefield layered with fear, guilt, temptation, and uncertainty. Phyllis could no longer look at him without seeing the shadow of everything he had done to the Newman family, yet at the same time, the man sitting before her no longer resembled the cold and calculating villain everyone remembered. His eyes no longer carried menace. Instead, they reflected confusion, exhaustion, and quiet desperation, as though he were drowning beneath the weight of a past he could not access. That emotional contradiction slowly began tearing Phyllis apart from the inside because every instinct she possessed was now pulling her in opposite directions. One part of her wanted to protect Nick, Summer, and everyone Matt once terrorized, while another part couldn't ignore the tragic reality that this broken man no longer even understood why the world around him seemed to hate him so deeply. Meanwhile, the pressure building around Phyllis's own legal nightmare continued tightening like a noose. Victor Newman's ruthless plan had already placed her in an incredibly vulnerable position, and the fear of losing everything haunted her constantly. The fake AI-generated evidence against her and Kane Ashby had been devastatingly convincing, crafted so carefully that even experienced legal minds struggled to challenge its authenticity. Genoa City had become a dangerous place for Phyllis almost overnight, filled with whispers, suspicion, and the growing possibility that prison bars might soon replace the freedom she had spent years fighting to maintain. Every conversation she had now carried hidden motives beneath the surface. Every decision suddenly felt tied to survival. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos stood Matt Clark, a man who might either become her salvation or destroy whatever future she had left. The possibility of handing him over to the Newmans began evolving from a passing thought into a genuine strategy, one capable of shifting the balance of power back in her favor before Victor completely crushed her. But Phyllis also knew the Newman family better than almost anyone, and that knowledge made the situation infinitely more dangerous. Victor Newman never handed out mercy freely, especially not to someone like Phyllis. If she approached him with Matt Clark as leverage, there was no guarantee he would honor any deal they made. Victor had built his empire on power, manipulation, and control, and Phyllis understood exactly how quickly he could turn the tables if it suited his interests. Nick, however, complicated things emotionally in ways Victor never could. Despite their turbulent history, despite the betrayals and heartbreak that had scarred both of them over the years, there remained an undeniable emotional connection between Phyllis and Nick that neither of them had ever fully escaped. She knew how deeply Matt's past actions had wounded him and Sharon Newman. She remembered the fear, the emotional destruction, and the constant chaos Matt had brought into their lives. And perhaps more importantly than anything else, she knew Summer Newman could become collateral damage if Matt's dangerous history resurfaced in the worst possible way. That realization alone carried enough emotional weight to keep Phyllis awake at night. At the same time, Matt himself continued spiraling deeper into confusion as strange fragments of his past slowly began crashing against the walls of his fractured memory. Faces triggered reactions he couldn't explain. Names stirred flashes of emotion that vanished before he could fully understand them. Every corner of Genoa City seemed to hold invisible ghosts waiting to confront him with pieces of a life he no longer recognized. The encounter with Noah had already shaken him badly, leaving him disturbed by the intensity of hatred directed toward him. But the more Matt searched for answers, the more terrifying those answers threatened to become. There were moments now when brief flashes of darkness crossed his expression, subtle hints that the dangerous man he once was might still exist somewhere beneath the amnesia. Those fleeting glimpses unsettled even Phyllis, reminding her that memory loss did not erase the possibility of old instincts returning without warning. And if Matt Clark ever fully remembered who he used to be, the fragile calm surrounding them could shatter instantly. As rumors quietly spread through Genoa City, an emotional storm slowly gathered strength behind the scenes. The Newmans remained unaware that one of their greatest enemies was already walking among them again, hidden in plain sight while Phyllis secretly weighed his fate in her hands. Yet the tension surrounding Nick was already beginning to rise. Spoilers teasing a dangerous deal hinted that he too would soon find himself pulled into risky territory, possibly without realizing just how close Matt truly was. The tragedy looming over the situation made everything feel painfully inevitable. Every road seemed destined to lead toward confrontation. Sooner or later, someone would recognize Matt. Someone would expose the truth, and when that moment arrived, years of buried rage and trauma would explode back to the surface all at once. Genoa City had seen countless wars between powerful families and dangerous enemies before, but this felt different because Matt himself no longer understood the monster everyone else remembered. For Phyllis, that truth created one final emotional complication she could not escape. Somewhere beneath all the scheming and survival instincts, she genuinely pitied him. She saw a man standing at the edge of an emotional abyss, surrounded by enemies, hunted by his own forgotten past, and completely unaware of the devastation waiting for him. It would have been easier if Matt had returned as the same manipulative villain everyone expected. It would have been easier if he had arrived with arrogance, cruelty, and revenge already burning in his eyes. But instead, fate delivered a broken stranger desperately searching for his identity, and that vulnerability forced Phyllis to confront uncomfortable questions about morality, redemption, and justice. Was Matt Clark still responsible for crimes he no longer remembered committing? Did a man without his memories deserve punishment for sins tied to a version of himself that seemingly no longer existed? Or was this all simply temporary, the calm before the inevitable return of the darkness buried inside him? Those questions lingered heavily as the city moved closer and closer toward disaster. The closer Phyllis came to making her choice, the more dangerous the situation became for everyone involved. If she betrayed Matt, she might save herself and protect the people she loved, but she would also be condemning a confused and vulnerable man to face the fury of an entire family determined to destroy him. If she protected him instead, she risked unleashing unimaginable consequences if his memories returned. Either way, there would be fallout. Either way, someone would suffer. And as the shadows of old grudges and unfinished revenge continued creeping across Genoa City, one thing became chillingly clear. The past was no longer staying buried. It was rising again piece by piece, dragging every person connected to Matt Clark into a dangerous collision course that promised heartbreak, betrayal, and emotional devastation unlike anything they were prepared for. As night settled over Genoa City, the emotional weight pressing down on Phyllis Summers became almost unbearable. The city lights shimmered outside the windows of Crimson Lights and the GCAC, casting a calm glow over streets hiding dangerous secrets beneath the surface. Yet inside Phyllis's mind, there was nothing peaceful about the storm raging within her. Every passing hour brought her closer to a decision that could permanently alter multiple lives, including her own. She had spent years surviving chaos, betrayal, and impossible situations by relying on instinct, but this time, her instincts were at war with each other. One moment she convinced herself that turning Matt Clark over to the Newmans was the only logical move, the safest move, the responsible move. The next moment, she found herself staring at the confused man beside her and seeing not a monster, but someone frighteningly human, someone lost, vulnerable, and completely disconnected from the darkness everyone else feared. That contradiction haunted her more deeply than she wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Matt continued searching desperately for pieces of himself in a city that seemed determined to reject him before he even understood why. Every interaction carried tension he could feel but not explain. Strangers looked at him with unease. Certain names triggered emotional reactions so sharp they almost felt physical. And somewhere deep inside his fractured memory, something restless was beginning to stir. There were moments when flashes of the past seemed ready to break through the fog. Blurred images, echoes of rage, glimpses of confrontation, but each fragment disappeared before Matt could fully grasp it. The uncertainty was slowly destroying him from the inside because he no longer trusted his own mind. He could sense that terrible things were attached to his identity, yet without memory, he had no way of defending himself against accusations he couldn't even remember earning. That growing desperation only made him cling tighter to Phyllis, who had become the one person in Genoa City willing to treat him with kindness instead of suspicion. But Phyllis knew kindness alone could not protect either of them forever. The deeper she became entangled with Matt, the greater the risk grew that Victor Newman would discover what she was hiding, and Victor was not a man anyone wanted as an enemy when secrets were involved. The fear surrounding the criminal charges hanging over Phyllis and Kane Ashby already consumed nearly every part of her life. The thought of prison lingered constantly in the back of her mind, poisoning every attempt at peace. She could practically feel Victor tightening his grip around her future, waiting for the perfect moment to crush her completely. That fear made the temptation surrounding Matt even more dangerous because he represented power in a situation where Phyllis currently had almost none. Delivering Matt Clark to the Newmans could instantly shift the balance. It could buy her leverage, it could create an opportunity to negotiate. And in Phyllis's world, survival often depended on recognizing opportunities before they disappeared forever. Yet emotions complicated everything in ways strategy never could. Despite all the history between them, Nick Newman still occupied a deeply emotional place in Phyllis's heart. Their relationship had endured betrayal, heartbreak, separation, and endless conflict. But certain bonds never fully disappeared, no matter how damaged they became. Seeing Nick hurt again was not something Phyllis wanted, especially knowing how much pain Matt Clark had caused him over the years. And then there was Summer Newman, their daughter, the one person capable of softening even the hardest parts of Phyllis's heart. Summer's safety mattered more than pride, revenge, or even freedom. If Matt's memories returned and the dangerous man from the past resurfaced, Summer could easily become caught in the fallout. That possibility terrified Phyllis more than she wanted anyone to know. Suddenly, this was no longer just about bargaining chips or legal survival. It was about protecting the people she loved before another disaster exploded across Genoa City. At the same time, fate seemed to be quietly pushing all the major players closer together. Nick remained unaware that the ghost from his past was already back in town, moving through familiar places under a cloud of amnesia and confusion. But tension was already building around him, and whispers of a dangerous deal suggested that he was about to become involved in something far more serious than he realized. Victor, meanwhile, continued manipulating events from the shadows like a master strategist positioning pieces on a chessboard only he fully understood. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood Sharon Newman, another woman whose life had been deeply scarred by Matt Clark's obsession years earlier. The emotional devastation Matt had inflicted on both Nick and Sharon had never truly faded, even after time passed. Old trauma had a way of surviving beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. If Matt's identity became public knowledge, those wounds would rip open instantly, unleashing years of buried anger, fear, and emotional pain. What made the situation even more tragic was the growing sense that Matt himself was beginning to realize the truth before anyone officially told him. The reactions around him were becoming impossible to ignore. Noah's hostility lingered in his mind like a warning sign he couldn't escape. Victor's name triggered unease he didn't fully understand. Even Phyllis had changed after their last conversation, though she tried desperately to hide it. Matt could sense her hesitation now, the subtle distance creeping into her expressions whenever he spoke about his missing past. And slowly, terrifying questions began forming in his mind. What if the people around him had good reason to fear him? What if he had done unforgivable things? What if the man he used to be was someone even he would hate? Those thoughts started poisoning every attempt he made to reclaim his identity, filling him with dread over what his memories might eventually reveal. As the emotional tension tightened around every character involved, Genoa City itself began to feel like a ticking time bomb waiting for detonation. The calm could not last much longer. Too many secrets were circling too closely together now. Too many people were unknowingly moving toward the same inevitable collision point. Phyllis stood at the center of it all, holding information capable of changing everything depending on what choice she made next. She could betray Matt and potentially save herself. She could protect him and risk disaster for everyone else. Or she could attempt to play both sides, a dangerous gamble that could easily spiral out of control. But regardless of which path she chose, the emotional fallout promised to be devastating, because in the end, the cruelest part of this entire situation was not simply that Matt Clark had returned to Genoa City. It was that he had returned without understanding the destruction attached to his own name. He wandered through a world already prepared to hate him, punish him, and fear him before he even remembered why. And as the shadows of his forgotten past continued closing in from every direction, one terrifying truth became impossible to escape. Sooner or later, Matt Clark was going to remember everything. And when that happened, the fragile balance currently holding Genoa City together could shatter beyond repair.